Since the early days of the British colonies, Christianity has played a vital role in the development of American history. Perhaps one of the greatest roles Christianity has played would be in the formation of the American concept of liberty during the days of the Revolution. Prior to the Revolution, several of the American colonies had developed largely due to the desire to worship freely. This desire for liberty that eventually would lead to the American Revolution and resulted in the American Republic has its basis in Christian thought and teaching. The profound impact Christianity had on America's understanding of liberty is quite amazing when we consider how diverse American Christianity was. Puritans, Anglicans, Baptists, Quakers, and even Catholics all made up the spiritual framework of the various colonies, each one unique, and each one firmly holding to the belief that their understanding of Christianity was accurate. So, how did such a dissenting group help form the unifying concept of liberty? Part of the answer lies a few decades prior to the Revolution, during the Great Awakening. In this time, people of all denominations became drawn closer together through a spiritual connection that transcended denominational lines. Men like George Whitefield toured the colonies, preaching to thousands, and in doing so, affected people of all denominations in all the colonies. This revival began a return to moral living, not only in personal morality, but also in political morality. Derek Davis mentions that this new pietism movement contributed strongly to the people's reaction to the revolution. For them, Great Britain was an immoral, tyrannical rule. The moral thing to do, therefore, would be to break away from the crown and establish a new government founded on the principles they valued throughout the Great Awakening. As time moved on, England's constant taxation and meddling began to weigh heavy on the minds of Americans. Politicians began to publicly denounce Parliament's actions as tyrannical and unjust. Pastors were close behind them in their sermons. Indeed, the actions of Great Britain were seen in such a light that obvious connections were made to the evils spoken of in the Bible. Aaron Shalev notes that many made the connection of the American people to the Israelites' exodus. There is the overbearing ruler, the overworked and underappreciated people, the promise of something greater to come, and of course the leadership of God-fearing men. Soon, sermons were coming from the pulpits that decried that resistance was not only needed, but encouraged. On June 7, 1773, Simeon Howard preached a sermon in Boston. After establishing that war may be just to protect liberty, he says, quote, "And oftentimes it may be both the right and duty of a people to engage in war, rather than give up to the demands of such a power what they could, without any inconveniency, spare in the way of charity. War, though a great evil, is ever preferable to such a concession, as are likely to be fatal to public liberties." End quote. With such a strong statement coming from within a sermon, we should take a quick look into one of the many fears of American Christians to better understand why such a strong statement had to be made. The American colonies, especially those of New England, had a long history of religious liberty, free from the Anglican Church. As far as the Anglican reach into North America went, it was mostly limited to the South. But this did not stop many from being afraid that soon the Church of England would establish a bishop in the colonies to reinforce royal religious authority. This fear was ever constant in the minds of Christians throughout the colonies. Then, as Great Britain began to extend their political power in the later part of the 1700s, it seemed as if the fear of an American bishop were possible. Terrified that Great Britain would soon interject their religious values over the colonies, preachers like Howard began to reject authority and assert liberty in its place. As the Revolution picked up, more sermons were made that appealed to the sense of liberty over tyranny. Soon the Bible was used in more than religious sermons to push political goals. In fact, the Bible was the most commonly cited text in Revolution documents. Daniel Dreisbach explains the Bible was something people would use to enrich common language and was often used to grab people's attention. Two great examples of this are Patrick Henry's Give Me Liberty or Give Me Death speech and Thomas Paine's Common Sense. While not overly religious, Patrick Henry's speech made use of several biblical phrases that would have been very easily recognized by most listeners. Phrases like, I have but one lamp by which my feet are guided, and God of hosts would resonate with those that frequently heard from the Bible. Common Sense, on the other hand, does appeal directly to Christians by interjecting a number of biblical references in Paine's attempt to convince the American people to rebel against British authority. One of the clearest references was the Israelites' acceptance of a king and how it ultimately led to the downfall of God's people. Further arguments were made evoking religious languages to fight against Great Britain. In the Declaration of the Causes and Necessity of Taking Up Arms, Jefferson begins the argument citing that God has granted humanity with the right to defend themselves, and ends it asking for God's blessing in the fight to come. The main source of biblical and Christian references, though, were still found in sermons. Baptists, Presbyterians, Puritans, and even some Anglicans strongly argued from the pulpit the evils of England and championed liberty. In Samuel Langdon's Government Corrupted by Vice, the point is made that the Americans have done all things possible to keep the peace, but the corruption of the British government has forced the war upon the Americans. In response, Langdon says that the Americans had, quote, taken up arms in our own defense, and all of the colonies are united in the great cause of liberty, end quote. John Witherspoon similarly said in 1776 that, quote, it is not only lawful, but necessary that the cause in which America is now in arms is the cause of justice, of liberty, and of human nature, end quote. As the Revolution moved on, many of these ministers proved that their words went beyond the pulpit by enlisting in the Continental Army and fighting for liberty themselves. These sermons, though, are still seen as proof that Christianity was ever present in the defense of liberty over tyranny. But what of religion and Christianity in the government to come? Near the later part of the Revolution, states began drafting constitutions and new governments began to take form. Most agreed that the best government to establish would be a republic. As Dreisbach mentions, the people believed that a republic could only work when morality was highly valued. Through this understanding, many came to the conclusion that a republic would work best in a Christian world. Mark Noll notes the connection between Christianity and American republicanism. He mentions that both recognized mankind's ability to do evil. Christianity was fully aware of the sinful nature of man and the despotic things man could do. Similarly, Republican ideology sought to ensure that government power would not be abused to establish tyranny, knowing full well that mankind was capable of such actions. They also held that there were similar understandings of virtue, freedom, and social well-being. In both understandings, sin and corruption cannot be present for a society to succeed. It should be clear that even through a brief overview, Christianity and Christian beliefs and thoughts were present prior to the Revolution, in the reasons to rebel against England, and also in the formation of American republicanism. The desire for religious liberty in the colonial establishment held true throughout the Revolution, resulting in a republic that shared several values with Christian ideology.